1,000 pounds of fury, 4 hooves, 1 broken soul in a black dress. They called him Devil's Coin, and no one, not a single wrangler, trainer or ranch hand in 3 counties had ever touched him without bleeding for it. He'd put 2 men in the hospital. He'd destroyed a barn door with 1 kick. And yet, on a cold Tuesday morning in October, a woman who had just buried her husband walked into that corral alone. No whip, no rope, no fear, and she just stood there. Before I tell you what happened inside that corral, I need to ask you something. Have you ever watched someone do something so quiet, so still, so unexplainable, that it stopped you cold, like the world paused for just a second to take a breath? Because that's what the people of Harlow County, Tennessee, described when they watched Maeve Sutcliffe walk up to a horse that had already sent grown men running. They weren't watching a trick. They weren't watching a show. They were watching grief do something none of them expected. If that kind of story is what you're here for, hit that like button right now, subscribe if you haven't yet, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to know where in this wide world you're watching from tonight. All right, let's go back to the beginning. Harlow County sits in the low hills of Middle Tennessee, the kind of place where the morning fog doesn't lift until almost 10, and the neighbors still bring casseroles when someone dies. It's not famous for anything in particular: a few tobacco farms, a river with good bass fishing, a grain co-op that's been run by the same family since 1947. People there live close to the land and even closer to each other's business. Maeve Sutcliffe had lived on the edge of that county her whole life, on a 200-acre horse property called Ashwood. Her late husband, Cal, had inherited the land from his father, and his father before him. 3 generations of Sutcliffes had bred quarter horses on those rolling fields, and the operation, though modest by some standards, had a reputation for producing working animals with good minds and solid bone. Cal had been the heart of Ashwood. Everyone said so, not to wound Maeve, but because it was simply true. He was the one who rose at 4:30, the one who knew every horse's quirk and preference, the one who could walk into a pasture of 20 horses and tell you in 30 seconds which one had a sore foot and which one was coming down with something. He had that gift, the quiet, particular attention that animals recognize and trust. When Cal died of a sudden cardiac arrest in August at 54 years old, the farm didn't just lose its operator. It lost its center of gravity. Maeve was 51. She'd always been part of Ashwood's life: bookkeeping, foaling season, the 1,000 small decisions that kept a farm running, but she'd never been its primary caretaker. That had been Cal's world. She'd lived beside it, loved him inside of it, but she'd always deferred to his knowledge when it came to the horses themselves. After the funeral, after the neighbors went home and the casserole dishes were returned and the flowers dried up and fell off the mantel, Maeve was alone in a way she had no language for yet. The mornings were the worst. 4:30 would come and she'd lie there in the dark, waiting for the sound of Cal's boots on the wood floor. And then she'd remember. The ranch hand who'd helped Cal, a young man named Decker, stayed on through September out of loyalty and pity in equal measure. He fed the horses, managed the turnouts, handled the basic maintenance. But Decker was 23 and had a family forming 2 towns over, and by early October he'd given his gentle, apologetic notice. That left Maeve, and it left the problem of Devil's Coin. The Stallion had arrived at Ashwood 6 months before Cal died, purchased at an auction in Cookville as what the seller diplomatically called a project. He was a dark bay, almost black in certain light, with a broad forehead, a white snip on his nose, and eyes that held something between intelligence and rage. He was 6 years old. He had been mishandled, that much was clear from the first week. Whoever had owned him before had tried to break him the old way: force, fear, repetition, and had instead broken something else entirely: his trust, his willingness to be in the world with human beings at all. Cal had believed in him. He'd told Maeve more than once that there was something underneath all that fury, something worth reaching. He just needs time and a different kind of quiet, Cal had said, standing at the fence one evening, watching the stallion pace the far end of his paddock like a storm that couldn't find land. Cal had never gotten the chance to find it. And now Devil's Coin stood in his paddock, still pacing, still furious, still untouchable. And Maeve stood on her porch looking at him with the same question hanging in the air every single morning. What do I do with you? She couldn't sell him. Not the way he was. No reputable buyer would take a horse like that without a full behavioral history, and his full behavioral history included a fractured wrist for a trainer in Nashville and a broken nose for a vet tech who'd gotten too close, too fast. She couldn't just turn him out and hope for the best, and she couldn't afford a specialist. The farm's finances were tighter now than they'd ever been. She had no one to call, no one who could help. What she had, all she had, was time and grief, and a farm full of memories of a man who believed that quiet was its own kind of language. She started going to the fence, not to do anything, just to stand there. The first week, she didn't even look at him directly. She'd read that once, years ago, in a book Cal had on the shelf, something about how predators make direct eye contact and how prey animals, which is what horses are at their deepest biological level, read a straight-on stare as a threat. She didn't know if she remembered it correctly. She couldn't find the book, but it felt right, instinctively, the same way certain things felt right to her in the weeks after Cal died. Like sleeping on his side of the bed, like leaving his coffee mug on the counter, like not moving anything too fast. So she'd stand at the fence in the morning with her coffee, turned slightly sideways, and she'd look at the middle distance, at the tree line, at the fog lifting off the low pasture, and Devil's Coin would be at the far end of his paddock, watching her with those dark, evaluating eyes, and she'd feel his attention like a hand pressed between her shoulder blades. She didn't approach the fence line. She stood about 15 feet back. She talked sometimes, not to him exactly, just out loud. She'd narrate the morning. The fog's heavy today. There's a pair of bluebirds nesting in the post oak. I heard them this morning before light. She'd talk about what she was planning to do that day, which fences needed checking, which of the older mares was due for her hoof trim. Ordinary things, the texture of a life continuing. She cried a few times. She didn't try to stop herself when it came. That was another thing grief had taught her, that fighting it was like fighting a tide. You just stood in it until it went back out. And she'd stand there at the fence with tears on her face and say nothing, and the stallion would watch her from his end of the paddock. And there was something almost companionable about it, two creatures with no way to explain what had happened to them, existing in the same cold morning. By the end of the first week, he had moved to the middle of the paddock. Not close, not approachable, but not as far. Her neighbor, a woman named Greer, who ran the adjacent property and had known Maeve for 30 years, came by on a Thursday with a pot of soup and stayed for coffee. She watched Maeve at the fence for a few minutes and then said very carefully, "The way you say something to a person you're not sure is sleeping. Maeve, that horse put Decker over the fence twice. You know that, right?" "I know," Maeve said. "You shouldn't be out there alone." "I'm not doing anything, Greer. I'm just standing." Greer looked at her with the particular expression of someone watching a friend do something inexplicable and choosing not to push further. She left the soup. She came back 2 days later with her nephew, a young man named Obi, who'd worked with problem horses before, offering his help. Maeve thanked her. She said she'd think about it. She didn't call Obi. What was happening at the fence didn't feel like something she could hand off or bring someone else into. It didn't feel like a training program. It felt like something else, something she didn't have a name for yet. It felt like the only time of day when she wasn't drowning. Greer told people about it, the way neighbors do, out of love and concern. And word traveled around the county the way words do in small places. Maeve Sutcliffe was standing at the fence with that killer horse every morning. Maeve Sutcliffe was talking to it. Maeve Sutcliffe hadn't called anyone, hadn't gotten help, was just standing there. Most people shook their heads. A few people drove slowly past the farm on the county road to see for themselves. What they saw was a woman in a dark coat standing at a fence in the morning fog. They saw a stallion who had moved by the end of the second week to about 30 feet from her. They saw nothing dramatic, nothing you could post online or call remarkable. They drove on. Inside the paddock, something else was happening. It was slow, and it was small, and it had no audience. It was happening in the angle of the horse's ears, which had shifted from pinned and aggressive to merely watchful. It was happening in the way he'd stopped pacing the fence line when she arrived, and had started instead to simply orient toward her, standing still, facing the direction of her voice. It was happening in the rhythm of his breathing, which Maeve was beginning to recognize the way you begin to recognize a particular birdsong, as a thing with its own pattern, its own meaning. She started bringing an apple. She didn't offer it. She just set it on the fence post. He didn't take it the first day, or the second, or the third. On the fourth day she arrived and it was gone. She couldn't be certain he'd taken it. It could have been a raccoon, could have fallen. But she felt certain, down in the part of herself where instinct lives, that he had. She left another one. On the seventh day she arrived at the fence, and he was already there. Not at the far end of the paddock, waiting, not in the middle. He was standing at the fence, 10 feet down the rail from her usual spot, and he had turned his head to watch her come up from the house. She stopped walking when she saw him. Her breath caught. She didn't know why. It was just a horse, just an animal at a fence. But something in her chest seized up the way it did sometimes when she found one of Cal's handwritten notes in a coat pocket, like being recognized by something you didn't expect to recognize you. She walked to her spot. She set down her coffee. She stood sideways and looked at the tree line and said quietly, "Good morning." He didn't move. Neither did she. They stood like that for almost 40 minutes until the fog burned off and the morning became ordinary again. By week 3, Maeve had started reading. She dug through the bookshelves in Cal's office. She still thought of it as Cal's, would probably always think of it as Cal's, and pulled out every book on horsemanship she could find. There were more than she'd realized. Cal had been a reader, a collector of other people's knowledge. She found worn paperbacks on natural horsemanship with his notes in the margins in pencil. She found a slim, spiral-bound booklet from a clinic he'd attended in 2009 in Lexington, full of diagrams with arrows showing body angles and pressure points and the geometry of how a horse's flight response worked. She read until midnight. She read with the same intensity she'd brought to grief, which is to say, completely, the way you do when a subject becomes a lifeline. What she learned or began to understand was this: what she had been doing accidentally was close to something intentional, standing sideways, not approaching, letting the horse define the distance, offering without demanding. These were principles, not just intuitions. They had names, they had a logic, and that logic was built on a single foundational idea. Trust is earned by the removal of pressure, not the application of it. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about Cal, who had never once in 30 years of marriage pressured her into anything, who had asked her opinion and waited for the answer, who had, she realized now, applied the same philosophy to humans that these horse trainers were describing for animals. She wondered if he'd known that. She thought he probably had. In that quiet way, he knew most things, not as a theory, but as a lived truth. She started applying what she was reading. She began moving her body differently at the fence. When Devil's Coin showed tension, ears back, weight shifting to his hindquarters, the particular tightening of his top line that she was learning to read, she'd turn even more sideways, drop her shoulder, let her gaze go softer, remove the pressure. And when he exhaled, that long, slow release through the nostrils that the books called a lick and chew, she'd feel something loosen in her own chest too, like they were breathing together. She started entering the paddock. The first time she just walked through the gate and stood inside the fence line, same distance, same posture, and then walked out again after 10 minutes. She did this for 3 days. Devil's Coin watched her from 20 feet. He didn't charge, he didn't retreat, he watched. On the 4th day, she walked in and took 2 steps toward him. He snorted and swung away, moving to the center of the paddock. She stopped immediately, turned sideways, waited. After a long moment, he stopped moving. She walked out. She thought about that for the rest of the day. Too much, she thought. One step. The next day. One step. He held his ground. She released, turned, walked to the fence, leaned against it with her back to him, and heard, after a long silence, the sound of large hooves on dry ground moving closer. She didn't turn. She felt him stop about 8 feet behind her. She kept looking at the tree line. She said low and even, "I'm not going anywhere." He blew out through his nose, not a snort, something softer, and she heard him shift his weight. And then, after another long pause, she heard him begin to graze. Just like that, like it was the most natural thing. Like she had simply become part of the paddock, something that belonged there, something that could be grazed beside. Tears came again. She let them. "I'm learning your language," she thought. Cal would have loved this. Meanwhile, Greer had told enough people that Maeve Sutcliffe's fence standing had become a kind of local curiosity. Hector Pruitt from the feed store mentioned it when Maeve came in for grain. "Heard you've been working with that wild one," he said, in the careful way of a man who's asking if you've lost your mind. "Just spending time with him," she said. "That horse put Tommy Raines in the hospital." "He did," she said, "and I'm sorry for Tommy. But something happened to that horse a long time ago, and I'm trying to figure out what's left of him underneath it." Hector looked at her for a moment and then said something that stuck with her. "You sound like Cal." She drove home with that sitting in her chest like a warm stone. There was also a woman named Vashti, a reporter from the county paper, young, sharp-eyed, working on a piece about the farm, who'd called twice and left messages about the horse. Maeve hadn't called back. This wasn't something she wanted narrated yet. It was too fragile. It was like a fire that would go out if too many people looked at it. She kept going to the paddock, and something else was happening too. Something she noticed but couldn't quite articulate. She was sleeping better. Not well, not the deep unconscious sleep of someone at peace, but better than the broken, waiting for boots on the floor sleep of the first weeks. She was waking up with purpose. She had a reason to get up at 4:30. She had somewhere to be. She had something that needed her. It was in the 5th week that Obi came back. Not because Greer sent him this time. He came on his own, pulled up in his truck on a Saturday morning and leaned on the hood and watched Maeve in the paddock from the road. She didn't see him at first. She was 20 feet from Devil's Coin, who was standing still, head slightly lowered, watching her with what she'd learned to read as the particular look of a horse that is uncertain but not afraid. She was moving in a slow curve, a technique she'd read about, using body angle and movement to direct pressure without contact. And the Stallion was tracking her, turning with her, like a compass finding north. When she came out of the paddock 20 minutes later and saw Obi's truck, she raised a hand and walked over. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been doing this?" "About a month." "By yourself?" "Yes." He looked back at the paddock. Devil's Coin had gone to the water trough and was drinking, entirely unbothered. "That horse tried to bite through the fence when the vet came in September," Obi said. "I know." "What you did just now, that approach and retreat, where'd you learn that?" She told him about the books, about Cal's margins, about the booklet from the clinic. He listened the way people listen when they're recalibrating something. "I'd like to come watch if that's okay," he said. "Not to interfere, just to watch." She thought about the fragile fire. She looked at this young man. He was maybe 25, with honest hands and a manner that reminded her a little of Cal, that particular still water quality, and she decided. "All right," she said, "come Tuesday." He came Tuesday. He sat on the fence rail and didn't say a word for the entire hour she worked. Afterward, over coffee on the porch, he offered a few observations, not corrections, but additions, the way someone who knows a language offers a word you haven't encountered yet. When his left ear flickers forward, he's asking a question. He's not being aggressive. He wants to know what comes next. That's actually a good sign. What do I do when that happens? Answer him. Give him something to do. Just a small thing. Ask him to move his hindquarters or take a step, something he can succeed at, so the question gets an answer, and the answer is, "You're safe." She tried it Thursday. It worked. The stallion's ear flickered forward, and she shifted her body angle the way Obi had shown her, quietly asking the hindquarters to step over. He did. She released immediately. His head went down. Success. She stood there with her hand not quite touching his neck and thought, "Cal, I wish you were here to see this, but also, strangely, for the first time, I'm glad I found my own way to it." That was new. That was the first time she'd had that thought, that something in her life since Cal was not just surviving but becoming, not replacing, not recovering in the sense of going back to what was, but becoming something that hadn't existed before. Obi came back twice a week. He brought a woman named Dornell one afternoon, a farrier, quiet and competent, who needed to assess Devil's Coin for a hoof trim that was long overdue. Maeve was the one who introduced Dornell into the paddock, who stood between them and managed the conversation of pressure and release, who watched the stallion's body language and narrated what she saw, so Dornell knew when to approach and when to wait. Devil's Coin let Dornell touch his front left foot. Just touch, just a hand on the cannon bone, a moment of contact, and then Dornell stepped back, but he let her. Dornell looked at Maeve afterward with something between respect and bewilderment. "How?" she said. "Slowly," Maeve said. "Very, very slowly." Word had spread further by then. Not gossip exactly. Something more respectful than gossip. More careful. The county paper ran a small item that Vashti had filed without asking Maeve again, based on what neighbors had told her. Local widow making progress with dangerous stallion. The headline was gentler than Maeve expected. She read it twice and folded the paper and set it on Cal's desk and didn't think about it too much. What she was thinking about was the next step, because she'd been working towards something without fully admitting it to herself. The books had a word for it. Obi had a word for it. The whole discipline she was stumbling into had this single luminous goal at its center. The first time you put a halter on, not riding, not even leading, just asking the horse to accept a piece of tack on its face, to lower its head and let you slide the noseband over and buckle it and stand there haltered and okay with all of it. For a horse like Devil's Coin, it was enormous. For Maeve, it felt like something she couldn't quite name. The difference between standing beside someone and taking their hand. She wasn't ready yet, but she could feel herself getting there. November came in cold and grey, and the farm felt quieter than ever. Maeve had settled into a rhythm. Up at 4:30, coffee, the walk down to Devil's Coin's paddock in the dark, flashlight in hand, the crunch of frost on the grass. She'd arrive and he'd be there, already there. That had become the thing she looked forward to most. The way he was always at the near side of the paddock before she arrived, as if he'd been listening for her footsteps, and she'd hang her flashlight on the fence post and they'd begin. She had a name for what they did in those mornings, the word she'd found in Cal's books, joining up. It wasn't the technical term that belonged to a specific method she was still learning, but it was what it felt like. Two living things, agreeing, morning after morning, to be in each other's company, to trust each other with the dark. Obi had begun introducing the halter slowly, the way you introduce any new object to a suspicious horse. Let him see it, smell it, let it touch his neck and shoulder until it becomes boring. Devil's Coin had sniffed it for 4 days running. He'd flinched when Obi let it rest briefly on his back. He'd allowed it the next day without flinching. Maeve had started holding the halter herself during their morning sessions, carrying it, not doing anything with it, just having it in her hand, letting it be part of the landscape of her presence, so that when the time came, the halter wouldn't be a new thing. It would be her hand, extended. In those November mornings, she also began for the first time to talk to him differently, not narrating, not the practical commentary of the first weeks. She'd started telling him the truth. "I don't know how to do any of this without him," she said one morning. I keep thinking I hear his truck on the road, and then I remember that still happens. I wonder how long it takes to stop." Devil's Coin's ears swiveled. His eye, dark and enormous and watchful, turned toward her face. "But you're helping," she said. "I know that probably sounds crazy. You're a horse, but you're helping." His head dropped just a little. The tension in his neck loosened. "I think maybe that's what Cal saw in you," she said. "Not just a project, a reason." She didn't realize she was going to cry until she already was. She stood there in the frost with tears on her face and the halter in her hand and Devil's Coin 3 feet away from her. 3 feet, the closest he'd ever stood. And she didn't move. She just let it happen. And then something happened that she would describe later. To Obi, to Greer, to anyone who asked, and never quite find the right words for. He walked forward and put his nose against her shoulder. Not a nuzzle, not affection exactly, something more like contact, the specific, deliberate touch of one creature saying "I see you" to another. His muzzle, warm and velvet soft, rested against the wool of her coat. She didn't move. She barely breathed. After a moment, she slowly raised her free hand and let her fingertips touch the side of his face. He didn't pull back. She moved her hand to the place behind his ear, and he dropped his head further, and she scratched there gently, and he blew out a long, ragged exhale through his nose. They stayed like that for a long time. She thought, "There you are. There's what Cal saw." She thought, "Hello." Back at the house, she called Greer and talked for an hour, which was more than she'd talked to anyone since August. She didn't fully explain what had happened, but Greer heard something in her voice that made her go quiet for a moment and then say, "Maeve, you sound like yourself." The halter went on for the first time that Friday. Obi was there. He stood at the fence, outside the paddock, with his arms folded and his face carefully neutral, the way you sit very still when something wild is deciding whether to land. Maeve stood in the center of the paddock. Devil's Coin came to her. She let the halter rest against his nose, and he breathed into it, that deliberate, investigating breath. And then she slid it up, one motion, unhurried, and he lowered his head through the noseband, and she buckled it and let go. He stood there, halted. He blinked. His ears went forward, the questioning look, and Maeve thought of what Obi had taught her, and she quietly asked him to take one step to the right. He did. She released. His head went down. Success. She unhaltered him immediately, turned away, walked to the fence. When she climbed over the rail, she looked at Obi and saw that his jaw was tight in the way of someone who was managing not to show too much emotion. "That," he said after a moment, "was extraordinary." "He did the work," Maeve said. "No," Obi said. "You both did. The video was not supposed to happen." Vashti, the reporter, had called again the week before, and Maeve had finally agreed to a brief conversation, not an interview, just a conversation, on the condition that nothing would be filmed without her consent. Vashti had agreed. She'd come by on a Wednesday, a small woman with a notebook and a phone she kept in her pocket, and Maeve had walked her around the farm and talked about Cal, and talked about the farm's future, and briefly, about Devil's Coin. "Can I see him?" Vashti asked. Maeve had taken her to the paddock and they'd stood at the fence and watched him for a while, and Maeve had explained what she'd been doing, the theory of it, the practice. Vashti had listened and taken notes and asked good questions and hadn't pushed for more than Maeve offered. She'd mentioned she might come back. Maeve had said that was fine eventually. What Maeve didn't know was that Greer's daughter, a 15-year-old named Pell, had filmed 10 minutes of Maeve working in the paddock 2 weeks earlier from the county road. Pell had done it on her phone just because she thought it was beautiful. This small woman and this enormous dark horse moving together in the morning fog, something she couldn't explain and couldn't stop watching. She'd posted it to social media without thinking much about it, with no caption except, "This is my neighbor's horse. He was dangerous." And she did this herself. By the time Maeve found out, it had been shared 14,000 times. Obi told her on a Saturday morning, looking slightly pale. He showed her the video on his phone. It was shaky and distant. You couldn't see Maeve's face clearly, but you could see the shape of what was happening. The woman, the horse, The fog. The particular stillness. The comments were full of the kind of things people say when they've seen something they don't have words for. She's a horse whisperer. This woman is incredible. Why am I crying? And then, buried among them, from someone with a large following in the equestrian world. Does anyone know who this woman is? This is some of the most beautiful natural horsemanship I've ever seen. I'm sorry, Obi said. I didn't know Pell had done this. Maeve watched the video twice. She watched herself moving in slow arcs around the stallion, the halter in her hand. She watched herself stop. She watched the horse. This horse that had fractured wrists and broken noses and been called unkillable and too far gone. She watched him walk forward on his own and put his nose against her shoulder. She watched herself raise her hand to the side of his face. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "That's Cal's horse." "What? I mean," she paused. "He would have loved him. I was just trying to understand what Cal saw." She handed the phone back. "I'll need to call Greer," she said. The phone call with Greer involved a brief and very sincere apology from Pell, who was mortified. Maeve told her, honestly, that she wasn't angry. She wasn't. She was something more complicated, exposed in a way she hadn't prepared for, but also strangely moved. That video was proof, not of anything she'd done, but of something that had happened. Between her and that horse, in those early mornings when no one was watching, it had been real, it had been seen. By Monday, Vashti had filed a full piece for the county paper that was picked up by a regional outlet. By Thursday, 2 national outlets had asked for comment. A horsemanship trainer with a large online following had made a video discussing what was happening in the footage and why it was technically significant. An organization that worked with at-risk youth and equine therapy reached out to ask if Maeve would consider speaking at an event. Maeve handled it with the same quality she'd brought to the paddock. Slowly, one thing at a time. She agreed to one interview. She spoke to Vashti, on record for 30 minutes. She said the things that were true. She had no training. She had books. She had a neighbor's nephew. She had grief. She had a horse who needed someone to be still enough to listen. "What do you think he needed most?" Vashti asked. Maeve thought about it for a moment. "To find out that not everyone is going to hurt him," she said. "And I needed the same thing, honestly. I needed to find out that the world still had something in it that could trust me." The day the piece ran, Maeve went to the paddock at 4:30 as usual. Devil's Coin was waiting. She halted him for the 5th time. She asked him to walk a short circle on the lead rope. He did, easily, willingly, head down and relaxed. She stopped him, stood beside his shoulder, and did what she had thought about for weeks, but never tried. She put her hand flat on his back, not leaning, not climbing up, just her hand on his back. He didn't move. She pressed slightly, just weight, just intention. And he shifted, but held. His ear turned to her. She released, stepped back, took a breath. Not yet, she thought, but almost. She thought of Cal. Always she thought of Cal, and what he would have said. She thought he would have smiled in that unhurried way of his and said exactly nothing, because some things don't need narrating. She led Devil's Coin once around the paddock on the halter. He walked beside her like a horse who had always known how to do this. At the gate, she stopped, unhaltered him, let him free. He didn't go to the far end of the paddock. He stayed near the gate, grazing, 3 feet from where she leaned on the rail. That was the moment. That was the thing she'd never be able to fully explain to the reporters, to the online commenters, to anyone who asked what it felt like. It wasn't the halter. It wasn't the hand on his back. It wasn't any single visible thing. It was a horse who had been hurt enough to stop trusting the world, choosing on his own to stay close. That was the whole of it. By December, Maeve had made several decisions. She hired a part-time hand, a young woman named Jessamine, a vet school dropout who knew horses and needed work, and began seriously restructuring how Ashwood operated. The breeding program would continue in a scaled-back form. The training side, helping owners work through problems with horses, was something Maeve was now considering with new seriousness. She'd already fielded 3 inquiries from people in the county who'd heard about Devil's Coin. She hadn't said yes yet. She wasn't sure she was ready to take responsibility for other people's horses, other people's problems. But she was thinking about it, weighing it against the shape of a life she needed to build. She met with a financial advisor, a steady, unhurried man named Ferris, who helped her see the farm situation clearly. It was not dire. It was tight but workable if she made some changes. She made them. She had Obi out twice more in December, less as a teacher now than as a colleague. He'd brought his own horse one afternoon, and they'd worked in the round pen together, side by side, and she'd realized how far she'd come, not in expertise, which was still young and incomplete, but in perception. She was seeing things now. The angle of an ear, the tightening of a flank, the position of a hind foot that told you whether a horse was at ease or coiled. She was reading a language she hadn't known existed 8 weeks ago. "You're a natural," Obi said. "I'm a student," she said. Same thing at the beginning. She got a Christmas card from Vashti, which was unexpected and touching. She got a letter, an actual handwritten letter, from a woman in Oregon who said she'd watched the video of Maeve in the paddock 17 times since her own husband had died 3 months ago, and that it had helped her in ways she couldn't explain. Maeve read that letter twice and then sat with it at the kitchen table for a long time, thinking. She wrote back. She said she was glad. She said she understood. She said grief did strange things. It sometimes led you to exactly the places you needed to be. She set the letter on Cal's desk, next to the newspaper. On Christmas Eve, alone in the house for the first time in 31 years, she cooked a small dinner and poured a glass of wine and sat at the kitchen table and talked out loud to Cal for about 40 minutes. She told him about the horse. She told him what she'd learned. She told him about Obi and Greer and Jessamine and Vashti's letter. She told him about the morning in the paddock when Devil's Coin had put his nose against her shoulder. And her voice broke when she got to that part, and she sat with it until it passed. "You would have had him halted by October," she said. "But I think you would have liked the way I did it too." She went to the paddock after dinner in the dark, with a flashlight and a carrot. Devil's Coin was waiting at the fence. She stood beside him for a while in the cold, his breath visible in the light, her hand resting on the warm barrel of his neck. The stars were out. The farm was quiet. Somewhere in the low pasture, an owl called twice and went silent. "Merry Christmas," she said. He leaned slightly into her hand, just slightly, the weight of a trust being offered. She stayed until the cold was too much, and then she walked back up to the house with the flashlight, making a pale cone on the frost-covered grass. And she did not feel, for the first time in months, entirely alone. Spring came, the way spring always comes in Middle Tennessee, gradually and then all at once, the fog lifting earlier, the mornings growing green. By April, Maeve was riding Devil's Coin, not in any dramatic way, not yet with speed or performance, just walking, around the paddock then around the near pasture, with her hands quiet on the reins and his ears forward, and both of them, horse and rider, navigating the extraordinary, ordinary fact of it. The first time she'd sat on his back, really sat, with her weight and her intention and all of it, she'd been shaking. She hadn't realized how frightened she was until she was up there and felt the aliveness of him beneath her, all that power and muscle and history, and understood fully what trust looks like from 1,200 pounds of it. He'd stood still. He'd let her ask him forward. He'd walked. Obi had been there, lead rope in hand, ready, but she hadn't needed him to use it. Devil's Coin had simply gone. Walked forward calmly, carrying her, ears going back and forth in that curious way of a horse paying attention to 2 things at once, the rider and the world. She'd cried again. She was getting used to that. The equine therapy organization had come back a second time, this time with a more specific proposal. They were developing a program for veterans with post-traumatic stress, using difficult horses as part of the therapeutic model. They'd heard about Devil's Coin. They'd heard about Maeve. They wanted to know if she would consider partnering in some form in the future. She told them she needed more time, more experience, more training. She needed to do this right. They'd said they were patient and that they believed she was worth waiting for. She thought about that sometimes. Being worth waiting for. It was an unfamiliar feeling. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. Like wearing a coat that was slightly too new. Vashti ran a follow-up piece in the spring, with Maeve's full cooperation this time. Photos, the whole story. The image that ran with it was taken by a photographer friend of Vashti's, a young woman named Rue, on one of those crystalline April mornings. Maeve on Devil's Coin in the pasture, walking along the tree line, her posture relaxed, his neck loose, the light coming through the oaks in long horizontal bars, the farm behind them, the fog just beginning to lift. Pell, who had taken the original video, saw the photo and texted Greer, "He looks like a different horse." He was a different horse. That was the true part of it. Something in him had reorganized, not been eliminated, not been suppressed, but reorganized, the way any living thing reorganizes around a new understanding of the world. He was still opinionated. He was still large and vivid, and difficult in the ways that excellent horses are always difficult. But the frenzy was gone. The particular terror that had driven the aggression, that had put men in hospitals and destroyed barn doors, that was gone. What had replaced it was a kind of watchful availability, the look of a creature that had concluded, after long deliberation, that this particular human being could be trusted with its attention. Maeve had read something in the months of study that she'd written in the margin of one of Cal's books. Not something Cal had written, but something she'd added herself, her own handwriting beside his. The horse doesn't forgive. It simply decides eventually that the past is not the present. She thought that was one of the more useful things she'd ever understood about horses and about almost everything else. She kept going to the paddock at 4:30. That never changed. The ritual of it, the dark walk down, the flashlight on the frost, the shape of him already at the fence, had become the frame around which the rest of her life hung. She didn't think she'd ever not do it, whatever else changed. Jessamine came full-time in May. She had steady hands and a good eye, and an ease with horses that Maeve recognized and valued. They worked well together, the two of them, more teaching than being taught now, on both sides. In June, Maeve took on her first client, a family from 2 counties over with a 4-year-old mare who'd become dangerous after a bad float on her teeth. She worked with the mare over 3 weeks, methodically, carefully, applying everything she knew. The mare came around. The family cried. Maeve charged them fairly and drove home thinking about what to do next. She thought about Cal. She thought about the morning she'd walked to the fence and just stood there with nothing in her hands and nothing in her plan. She thought, this is where that started. There's something I've been thinking about since I first heard this story. We spend so much time looking for the moment, the dramatic turning point, the scene where everything changes, the before and the after. But Maeve's story doesn't really have one of those. There's no single morning you can point to and say, there, that's when it turned. It was all of it. The daily act of showing up, the willingness to be still, the daily decision to go back, even when nothing visible had changed. The grief that, rather than closing her down, somehow opened a door to something she'd never looked for and couldn't have found any other way. Devil's Coin is still at Ashwood. He'll probably live out his days there. She said she'd never sell him. Couldn't at this point, even if she wanted to. He's Ashwood now. He's part of what the farm became after. And maybe that's what this story is really about. Not the horse, not even the widow, but what becomes possible when you stop trying to force the world back into the shape it was before it broke. When you walk up to the thing that frightens you, not to fight it, not to fix it, but just to stand beside it in the morning fog and say, I'm here, I'm not going anywhere, because sometimes that's enough, sometimes that's everything. If this story moved you, if it made you think of someone or something you've been standing at a distance from, tell me in the comments. Drop your city. Hit that like button and subscribe because we've got more stories like this one waiting for you. I'll see you in the next one.